So thank you again to everyone. And now I will be able to present. Oh, excuse me, Slim then. Thank you. I will introduce Christelle. So I will be able to introduce Christelle. So I have my little note, Christelle, to introduce you, even though I've known you for quite some time. In any case, you know me. It's not necessarily me. I was already watching you. I was already a fan before. There you go. Basically, Christelle Lison is a professor at the University of Sherbrooke. Maybe some of you know her. She is someone who works in the field of educational sciences, very well known in the field of educational sciences. She has been exploring these topics for about 15 years. These topics of concern, these specialties, are the competency-based approach, assessment of learning. You see, we're right in the middle of it. Also, the professional development of teachers and many other things. Again, it's true that I have been watching these conferences for a very long time. And by the way, I am very happy to see that you have done work when I was teaching courses to students, especially at Trends 2 in the Education Center. I worked with them on crystal content in particular. So there you go. She is the author of many articles, books, etc. around these themes. And then what's interesting with Christelle is that she also bridges the gap. She is someone who bridges the gap between institutions. She often comes to France. In fact, for that matter, I have also seen her live at conferences. So she is very well known in France. And she bridges the gap between people, between institutions, educational engineers, researchers. And finally, well, for me, it's more perhaps a personal point of view, but what I find interesting with Christelle is that she still has a very hands-on approach, very down-to-earth as well, I think. I see that you nodded, Christelle. It's true that it's something all the more interesting because it's concrete, in quotes, even if it is still based on very scientific things at its core. I won't necessarily take more time. In any case, Christelle, I thank you again for your presence, everyone. And then, Christelle, what we're going to do, as we said, is basically 40 minutes of presentation, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. There will be microphones, etc. So you will be able to interact. Feel free to jot down your questions, maybe even during the presentation. And then, Christelle, can you hear us well already? I hear you very well. And you too. So, coming to us from Montreal, you'll notice a very slight accent. You have a heart.
You'll see it's really subtle.
There you go. Thank you anyway, Christelle. It's your turn then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share my slideshow with you. And if there's anything during the meeting that doesn't go exactly as planned, just let me know. So indeed, I'm going to talk to you about a competency-based approach. Julian told you it's been over 15 years, so you can guess my age. I really appreciate him explicitly mentioning it, that I'm old now. But in any case, indeed, these are questions that fascinate me. And I strongly believe in the field approach because indeed, for me, that's where it becomes grounded in reality. I often use the expression, at some point, the boots need to follow the lips. It's really the idea that you need to take action for it to work. So today I chose to title the presentation when we prepared it, with Stéphane and Julian in particular, the idea of student skills from their development to their evaluation. Then I will try to focus on some points to allow you to work this afternoon in the workshop. So the first question we ask ourselves, and it may seem trivial, but it's important, is what are we talking about when we talk about a competency-based approach? You've been working on this for a little while. The question, but it's really essential for me that you have a clear vision, what we are talking about. So the first thing, and I think it's essential in my way of approaching it, is that it's a means and not a trick. The idea is not for you to reach the end saying, great, IMT Business School, we have a check on the competency-based approach, it's done. Of course, you might say to me, yes, but if we think in terms of program accreditation, it's one thing that's true. But there's an important element, which is that it remains a means to enhance student learning. What we have observed in the literature over the last 20 years is that this approach, which is not a completely unilateral one, is not in a mindset of this is what must be done, but is truly an approach aimed at sharing and diversifying our practices with the goal of enhancing our student learning. Not exclusively, an approach in terms of knowledge development, and you will see the distinction I make here. The knowledge skills debate has been, because I think it was diminishing, very French-centric. That is to say, if we look at the definitions of skills, I have chosen one. Attack it because, as you know, in the humanities and social sciences, we sometimes like to quibble over terms. But I would say that all the definitions roughly share the same views on what a skill is today. It has become more refined, of course, from its beginnings in the late 90s. And in the early 90s, and today we have a more stable definition, a concept with clearer characteristics. We are going to talk about a complex ability to act, which relies on the effective mobilization and combination of a variety of internal and external resources within a family of situations. It might seem a bit jargony, but if we think about it, this idea is that we will mobilize different resources, and the UE, the courses. The knowledge, these are resources that are initially external. Your teaching is an external resource, and the student will internalize this resource. The knowledge that you will present to him, he will internalize it. He will turn it into understanding. So I cannot be competent if I don't have knowledge. It's quite obvious that we are in this logic of having knowledge, but we will go beyond that. Complex know-how is more than just a skill. It's more than just knowledge. It's more than just a way of being. It's a combination, and the student will have to seek out. Within ultimately all these knowledges offered to him, the knowledge he has, the activities, the real world experiences, the elements to finally be able to solve a problem within a family of situations. If I finish a course in aeronautical engineering, I am not an engineer in the broad sense. I have skills within a family of situations. So if we look at the overall characteristics, the importance of having a skill is the idea of an integrative nature. Combinatorial, I will have a multitude of resources and I must mobilize them at the same time. So we enter a very interdisciplinary logic. We are in a contextual space. These are specific contexts, not necessarily as big as that. We can be in something broader, but a skill is not automated. We are not in a reflex. We are in something where there is cognitive processing on the part of the student. And then it is something that is developmental and evolutionary. So throughout life, the person will continue to develop their skill. You today are much more competent than you were when you started. So this is an important element not to lose sight of when we talk about what we are evaluating. We are indeed in this logic of evaluating more than just knowledge. In this idea of competence, and you have seen it in the approach, you have worked with the RNCP files, you have defined elements of competence. We are in an approach where the idea is that we are a collective. We think as a team. AP stands for Program Approach in the model of Loisy and colleagues, which says we have a training project. We have a vision of our graduate. Where are we taking our graduate? It's not just someone who leaves with a small accumulation of little layers of knowledge, and they haven't learned the layer from Julian's course. We don't care. We reconstruct their sausage. No, it doesn't work like that. The competency-based approach is an integration. An integration, we take the student with our vision of the graduate, with the competencies we have chosen. Maybe if I were at Centrale Nantes, there would be other competencies. There will probably be things in common, but we will color it according to who we are, obviously, as an institution, as a program. These are choices we make, editorial choices as a teaching team, as a team of a higher education institution. And then we will work to bring the students up to where we take them. So in this idea of a global approach, obviously we can ask ourselves how we do it. Here, I'm just giving you the big blocks. To get to my question about evaluation, as you will have understood, understand, however, that for me, there is a challenge today. When you are in the workshop, I would like you not to lose sight of it, to define complex knowledge in students, to help them develop it. I cannot do it alone. You know, it can't be, oh, but Christelle does this, Stefan does that, Sophie does this, Julian does that. No, we are in something where we form a team. And a team is a collective defined with permanent staff and part-time staff. In this team, of course, we have teachers, researchers, but also administrative staff, academic staff, and the people who assist us with technical tools. We all form this collective. We all have our part in the journey, including the students. Obviously, when I am a professor, as a teacher researcher, I am this homo academicus that Bourdieu talks about. So I will have research tasks, administrative tasks, or community service tasks. But I still have a real teaching task when we talk about a competency-based approach. The core is to be a homo pedagogicus. And days like today allow you to develop as a homo pedagogicus as well. Because if we want to approach a new method like the competency-based approach, which is indeed a transformation of professions, in higher education, we need to be able to be supported in this change. But you know it as well as I do, the advantage of being a teacher researcher is to function a bit like small individuals who operate each on their own. Except I can be Iron Man and Stefan can be Hulk and Sophie can be Spider-Man. We remain separate superheroes. To become the Avengers, we will need to think as a team, not just say, yes, but me in my course. Yes, but me in my UE. Yes, but me. Okay. But we can't just be me. At some point, we need to have a we. And this team thinking is what will unite you in the workshops today. It's important to think as a team, take a step back and then say, wait, if I think about the school staff I work with, if I think about this type of evaluation, how does it work? At the level of support services, technical services, how does my colleague evaluate? What do they assess? So we are indeed a team. We are collectively responsible for the skills developed by the students. But in collectively, it doesn't mean that I don't care. And if I don't do it, oh well. But a collective is a co-responsibility for that. So I am not the only one bearing the weight of the competency-based approach in my institution. We are a collective. It also means dare to change the paradigm. This idea of paradigms is the things with which we have a framework. As a group, we share a certain number of paradigms. It's the idea of thinking that before we were in a very fragmented logic. An individual, a course, a UE, an evaluation, it's settled. We pass, we fail, how we retake it. In the competency-based approach, we are in a much more integrated logic. We will operate with elements of knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are much more integrated than sliced like my slices of salami. This means that on one hand, I am in a very unit-based teaching approach, a very disciplinary logic as well. The student will have such activity, such UE, such course in a competency-based approach logic, much more of a pathway. That is to say, which pathway leads to the vision of the graduate we have? Which pathway leads to the person's graduation? This leads us to reflect on certain things, to ask ourselves, are the pathways we offer viable? We are not in a cafeteria logic where I choose my elective courses, but rather in a logic of constructing my vision. If I have skills, but Sine, which pathway? Yeah, and there can be multiple. Does the student take to achieve the diploma certification we provide? Because there is a commitment as an institution to say here is the level of development achieved by our students. So we are as teachers, educators, researchers, also the OS bearers of this approach. We will certify based on the evaluative activities, but also the learning activities we provide to the student, what they will manage to achieve. And so that means when I am in a UE approach, it's the student who puts the pieces together, assembles the photos, and builds their album. Then if the photos from Stefan's course didn't turn out well or he forgot them, it's not a big deal. He removes the page and does something else, more or less. That means sometimes when you interview students at the end of their program, when we look at them, they sometimes say to us, no, not at all. I've never seen that. It doesn't ring a bell. And you think, well, come on, it's in the training program. The student just didn't put the pieces together. When I am in a competency-based approach, it is us as the teaching team who explain the relationships between the content. We understand why a certain activity happens at that moment, why we offer an internship here, why we implement this strategy, why there is a project that appears here. So we build the path. Does that mean it's perfect? Not on the first try, no. Other times when, upon looking at it, we say to ourselves, our path isn't quite logical. Indeed. I'll give you a concrete example. A few years ago, while supporting my colleagues in engineering, electrical and computer engineering in their competency-based approach, someone said, students often tell us that a certain educational activity, when it appears, was a project, and they haven't yet had certain courses that would allow them to complete the project. So in the end, they end up looking for the information on their own, and then when the course comes, they find it unnecessary. We revise the training framework by asking ourselves, okay, does this mean we need to provide certain training content to help them develop certain skills and knowledge at different times to enable them to complete the project, which is ultimately a complex learning and evaluation situation, as you will see. So we revise things. It's never perfect on the first try. We dive into the approach, we try things, and there might be parts to revisit. That's completely normal. But remember, it's a means, not an end. So we are in a work in progress. That's how life works. We can't always be in a mindset of having the right answer. Science doesn't work like that. Higher education teaching doesn't either. Obviously, when we enter this mindset, there is reevaluate our graduate. Who is our IMT Business School graduate? Today, they are not the same as 20 years ago. They are not the same when entering the pipeline. We can't be the same when coming out. In a moment, you will address the issues of artificial intelligence. We cannot ignore these issues today in the training of graduates. As an individual, you might say, yeah, I'm for it, I'm against it, you can do whatever you want, but today we can't think that we're going to train someone who will go to work tomorrow morning, because remember, we still want them to go to work. They are going to pay for retirement, all these people, so they need to work in a much wider and more diverse range of environments than we could have imagined 20 or 30 years ago, but we will have to reevaluate it. The questions of ecological transition, the ethical questions that arise, social responsibility. We have never had so many pressing questions today, and we feel it among the students. We even feel a certain global anxieties around some elements. And I assure you that when you are in North America right now, there are a lot of questions coming to the table. We feel that people who are studying are asking much broader questions, sometimes beyond our content elements. That's part of the reality. We need to think about it in a global approach. A global approach means understanding that we obviously have a competence, and you have worked with the sheets, art and CP, you have reworked them, you define them, and we will ultimately break it down until we can evaluate them. And that's where we will work. What are we evaluating? It's not the competencies themselves, it's the learning outcomes, what you'll see, that will allow us to infer the student's level of competence. So in this global approach, I obviously have a professional framework. Where am I taking my students? It's the idea, as I was telling you, of where they will go after graduating from our program. Then you might say to me, yes, but maybe I have a student who will go work in a bank after completing our program. Absolutely. But those are not the professions you have prepared them for. They can go into a variety of fields, but you still have a vision of where your graduates are going. I have my competency framework, and then I will have my training and evaluation framework. And that's what we're going to focus on here. The first thing to focus on is, remember, we operate in alignment. I have training content. I have my learning outcomes, what I will clearly work on with my students. I have my teaching activities. I have my evaluation strategies, and all of this must be aligned. How do I ensure that there is coherence between my components? How do I ensure that what I evaluate is indeed what I say I am evaluating, and that I truly allow students to work on it? I am consistent, and all of this is supported today by digital tools, by artificial intelligence, by digital learning environments, by the software you can provide them with. And there we need to find alignment. Is it simple? No. Does it lead us to be challenged? Yes, very clearly. But I think it's an opportunity not to lose sight of the fact that we are in a context, and this context we are not necessarily the carriers. You make choices institutionally, you make choices as an establishment, but there are many things coming from outside that make our context dynamic. The important thing, the focus you will have in this academic setting, is to remember that we are here for the students' learning. We are not here to tell you, well, you are going to do this, and then say, well, but it bores me, but whatever. Remember, now, like, our core mission as teachers, as teacher researchers, as staff working in a higher education institution, it is the students' learning. Does that mean that sometimes we shake them up? Yes. Yeah, be aware. There are students who find that the competency-based approach is unsettling because it pushes them to their limits. What research shows us is that learning only happens in the gap we have. It's between our conscious feeling of incompetence and succeeding in the things we do. The learning, if I'm left in a kind of routine where I'm never shaken up, I don't make real learning progress. And certainly not sustainable learning and in-depth. So yes, we are going to shake them up. But this alignment, I have it at the level of my teaching activities, and I have it at the level of my training framework. Understand where I am going completely in my training program. That's the competency-based approach. It's this global vision, no longer thinking of oneself as an individual giving a course unit to a student, but understanding how I can contribute to this collective space and how my teaching activities enable development. So I have alignment, obviously, at the level of each activity, and a global alignment. And maybe there you will say, hey, then that competency we had said doesn't make much sense at this point. It isn't addressed in that unit. In all the competency programs that I have either supported or led in my own institution, we have had revisions. We went back to the drawing board. Remember, it's a means but not an end. Of course, there were times when I was like, that's it, it's done, it's settled, basta così. But it hasn't always worked out that way. We had to revise because the reality on the ground tells you Hello, darling, it was great on paper, but it doesn't work. We need to get back to work a little bit. But when we have solid foundations, we move forward and we are able to do it. Remember, we are now entering that famous phase of evaluations. Evaluation. Yeah, I want to tell you first that it is the stumbling block for all preschool teachers. So in kindergarten, in corporate training, in senior universities, it's the part we're not very sure about. And it's really a part where the majority of teachers say to themselves, ugh, I don't know if I'm really evaluating what I say I'm evaluating. Are there people in our institutions who have failed and should have succeeded? Are there people who have succeeded and probably should have failed? Yes. But we all did our best. Evaluation is not simple, and it is extremely emotional. We touch a bubble where we say to ourselves, yes, but, and I would tell you that right now, there are a lot of questions because artificial intelligence is clearly causing a shakeup. What my colleague Isabelle Nizet calls the pillars of the temple. But yes, we've asked ourselves a lot of questions, and now we have two spaces. Do we go back and say we're going to have 2-hour written exams without anything? And then there you go, we'll solve the problem, but we won't assess skills? Or do we say how? I am capable of revising things, and that will be the whole point of your workshops. Remember, you won't do worse than what you did before. You will have ideas, you will be inspired. Trust yourself, you will move in the right direction. First important thing, I told you earlier when we talk about skills, have common terms to avoid arguing during meetings that lack meaning. What is evaluation? It is a process. Evaluation partner is not grading. It is never grading. Sometimes that's what students think, but it's not that. It is a complete process. A process that actually involves gathering information about learning that has been achieved by the student. And we do it both from a formal and informal perspective. The formal part is the grade. But sometimes when you move around in teams, for example, during assignments, during lab work, during tutorials, during projects, when you go to see them once during an internship, sometimes you say, it seems the student is not on the right track. But I'm not going to give them a grade. I'm going to give them advice. I'm going to explain to them. So that's from an informal perspective. Encouraging a student, telling them, yeah, you're on the right track, helping them to realign, all of that is a form of evaluation. Evaluation is not just a grade. This evaluation, based on the information gathered, I will interpret it, I will make a judgment, and then I will make a decision. My judgment could be my grading, my decision could be whether the student passes their semester or, on the contrary, fails their semester. Our relationship with evaluation is very culture dependent. In Quebec and in France, we are in two opposing systems. In Quebec, the notion of failure exists, but it is very rare. The concept of repeating a year doesn't really exist. It doesn't work like that. And having grades that would be rather low would be a sign of poor health. Also on the teaching side in Quebec. So these are issues. For example, when we welcome students, we will translate French grades into the Quebec scale. Depending on the institutions, there are grade reviews and there will be a translation. In Quebec, having a 14 is not a good grade. The student would not be admitted to a master's program. So you understand that we are often in situations of adaptation. Therefore, the grade which seems so objective is far from being objective. And to tell you, in my institution, and this is the case in Quebec actually, we will have a grade out of 100 that will be translated into letters, which will be converted to a 4.3 average. Welcome to objectivity and relevant work. But when we are in kindergarten, we find that clouds, sun, and rain, snow is a bit nonsensical. Someone will have to explain to me how our entire journey is much more objective and clear than clouds, sun, and rain. So as you can see, it's always subjective. Evaluation is always subjective. What we are going to try is to instrumentalize it, to make it as objective as possible, to be able to support our point of view, to be able to explain why we made this judgment and took this decision. And then to do this, we will use different technological tools, sometimes not at all, sometimes a lot. Currently, as you might expect, we have tests where artificial intelligence corrects some of the students' work. Is it perfect? No. Will things improve? Yes. How do we approach it? How do we position ourselves in the age of AI? Our relationship with evaluation can no longer be thought of in the same way as before. Because if you want to have a complex product evaluated, It might very well be that AI produces it. You could see how you will transform things. Are we perfect at the moment? No. But we are clearly in a reflective mode, and I think it's important as a collective, we are getting started. And then remember, the goal of the evaluative process is to enable the stakeholders of the institution, our colleagues, teachers, teacher researchers, administrative staff, but also ultimately the person holding the right to confer degrees to attest to the competencies developed by the student. That is still the purpose of evaluation. It's not to see if they have learned well, meaning in the sense of repeating what they were told in class. If the student has been a good little parrot and copied everything onto their sheet, everything you said in class, it doesn't mean they have learned. Be careful. Passing an exam does not mean learning. I can fail and have learned a lot of things. I can succeed and not have learned much. In my life journey, I completed a master's degree in psychology. I started with a bachelor's degree in psychology. To tell you everything, the equivalent of a license. And when I started, I had a great course in psychology about language from which I remembered 3 things. The professor's name was Michel because he had the same first name as my father. Secondly, Ferdinand de Saussure. Thirdly, monym and phoneme. 45 hours of classes, 16 out of 20 on the exam. You'll agree with me that my learning was relatively limited, but I got a good grade. So you can see the grade is not a reflection of the learning achieved. When we talk about evaluation and a competency-based approach, we will talk about trajectory, about development. We will move from novice to expert. You today in the room, you are experts in your field. The student who enters is a novice, an intermediate, depending on where we are in our program. Obviously, throughout our training, we will guide the student to become more and more competent. Often programs will go from novice to competent. We agree that for the rest, it's continuing education that will play a role. It's the experiences in real world settings that will play a role. You have a target. We cannot take the student all the way to the end, but we will guide them to develop this development trajectory as they progress through their process. So the evaluation is conceived as a trajectory or trajectories of development. In this idea, we will therefore have a diversity of functions for evaluation. I allow myself to highlight this because it's still an important element to say, sometimes I can do diagnostic evaluation. That's where I will target the student's prior knowledge. Where are they at? I'll give you a concrete example that I conducted with a colleague in the equivalent of STAPS. She was teaching the first year course on anatomy. She taught the second year course, Anatomy Plus, where students continue their development. One of the elements she raised, that is the students who arrive in course 2 have not achieved deep learning from course 1. And this poses a problem for me because there are fundamental contents now that are not mastered, that are not necessarily understood. And so when we enter the second part, it presents a challenge. So for example, we conducted a diagnostic test at the beginning of the course where the students, we targeted 5 key concepts. There are 3 questions per concept. It's a quiz. It's a quiz that doesn't count. There is no grade. But we tell the students, based on the score you get, that is on the quiz, you can consider that if you don't have at least 80%, you do not sufficiently master the concepts to be able to continue with the next course. So we have uploaded on Moodle, which is the university's digital learning environment. We have provided some fundamental elements that can help them solidify their initial knowledge and skills in certain content areas. And then, she says, you can build the rest. This is diagnostic assessment. I can have a formative assessment. For example, when I guide students in a project, I will give them feedback. There are no grades. I will help them. If I read a piece of work, I can say, this section here, this is how you should rework it. The idea is to allow the student to work on certain sections, to go deeper, to realign with the needs. Or it could be perfect. You're on the right track, keep going with your exercise. So it's something that isn't graded. I am really in a learning perspective. I can have a summative assessment, which will be worth points, an attempt. And then I can have a certifying assessment. I would say it is rarer, obviously, in programs, but in terms of skills, it could be that. These are elements that cannot be failed. They would lead to exclusion from the program. We sometimes find it like internships that are certifying with almost a piece of field. If you have it, that's perfect. If you don't have it, you cannot continue. We sometimes see this with the thesis. In some programs, the thesis will be a certifying element. You are required to pass it. You cannot compensate. And here you see where I'm going with competency-based evaluation. Tardif would tell you we cannot practice compensation. Indeed. In any case, certainly not between competencies. I would tell you that within competencies, and as you have understood, I'm not selling anything. I think we need to find adaptations. But indeed, there are competencies that cannot be compensated. I cannot compensate elements that would not make sense together. Think about your competencies from your RNCP sheets or those you have worked on. There are competencies that are non-compensable. I cannot say, I take one, replace it with another, it's correct. Within, I might be able to find adaptations. To carry out my 4 evaluative functions, I told you it's a process. There is always an approach. My approach, I summarize it here with the idea that I plan my evaluation. What am I going to evaluate? How am I going to evaluate it? At what moment am I going to evaluate? Who am I going to evaluate? I will collect my information properly. I will go gather my data, and here I allow myself a little clash on the evaluations of continuous assessments. But the continuous assessment, which was originally intended to bring students into a mindset of working all the time, has sometimes become a little game of mini quizzes. What we know is that students do not engage in this type of thing. The idea in the competency-based approach is not to evaluate more than before. Use the competency-based approach to eliminate. Conduct more complex assessments instead of them. So do not get into an endless cycle of information gathering. You need to have a much more complex and comprehensive view of the process. I will analyze and interpret the data. That too, if I conduct assessments every week, you are constantly in correction mode. I don't know about you, but for me, if there's one thing that disgusts me in life, it's corrections. Do I hate it? To avoid doing that, I must not get into this logic of micro little things. When I was supervising temporary staff, some of them would tell me, I can't correct. When I looked at their schedule, I would say, but actually, you spend your life evaluating them, so you spend your life correcting. Yeah, but it's to engage them. Well, no, it doesn't engage them because the students after a while get disgusted and do the bare minimum. Oh, but they'll go for what gives the most points. Let's be strategic. I hope that you too, just like me, did it when we were students. There is indeed a strategy that is put in place. You make a judgment and you decide, as I mentioned earlier. So the first thing is when we talk about skills, we will formulate what we call learning outcomes. I have provided you with an example here from colleagues at INSA, but learning outcomes are the expectations of the training. So it's the idea that at the end of the course, the activity, the program, what will the student have, know, be able to do? What will they really be at the heart of the action? So we are using an observable verb. With an object, we are in a family of situations in a context. The idea is to improve the readability of the training. Not a list of contents, but truly elements that will allow us to understand through a statement what the student will be able to do. How it will be when they have validated this skill, this UE. So it must be clearly accessible. When I say observable, it's not just in the sense of observing with your eyes, but accessible, observable with criteria. So you see, our colleagues at UCLUVAN and UHA, they said we are going to address knowledge, potential skills, aptitudes, capacities, behaviors, qualities, know-how, and interpersonal skills. These are tangible things. For you, it's in the idea of micro skills. Micro skills, which for me are forms of achievements of learning. And that's why I was telling you, what's important is to agree as a collective on the vocabulary. You say that it corresponds to specific knowledge, skills, and attitudes like mastering software, writing a report, conducting an interview. We are dealing with something that I can observe as a teacher. I can give my judgment on it. My learning achievements, I will therefore develop them by level. Here, I took an example, which is the speech therapy framework from colleagues at the University of Liège. They have their competencies, taking responsibility for prevention in the field of disorders within the speech therapist's scope of action. You will have understood that I have used it several times. I know it well. And then they have 3 levels. It's a 5-year program. They have 3 levels: novice, intermediate, competent. They have developed what it means for each level, and they have different learning outcomes for each of their levels. I allowed myself to do the exercise with one of your frameworks. It is very imperfect. then you will notice that I allowed myself some small feedback at times. I chose the competency of acting as a professional and citizen to address major challenges, ecological, social, and economic transitions. I saw two levels there, but that's my perspective. You will understand from the Excel files, which I kindly received from Julianne. So I set a novice and competent level, taking into account the complexity of one's work environment, making responsible decisions within the scope of one's role. And I allowed myself to try to seek learning outcomes, propose action plans, and engage stakeholder buy-in. Then you see below, I chose 4. It's a rather imperfect exercise that I did from an external perspective. What I wanted to show you is that it's possible to position it. Then there we can see from that where I evaluate it and how I evaluate it. If I evaluate it through multiple and varied evaluation strategies. Again, a concrete example here, that of my colleagues at the Faculty of Engineering, Electrical and Computer Engineering. You see, for them to achieve this, they talk about the qualities of the engineer. You should know that they have an accreditation office for engineering programs in Canada. So you understand that we have a Francophone-Anglophone issue, and that the Anglophones do not question the idea of competence. So they have put quality to reach everyone, but we are indeed in the definition of competencies. They have chosen learning and teaching strategies. The purpose today is not to talk to you about that, but they have made choices, as you can see, diversified. And they have a diversity of evaluation strategies, both team-based and individual. As you can see, they have practical exams, written exams, projects, reports. They have peer evaluation. They have internships. They have development plans. They have formative and summative assessments. As you can see, they have problem-based and project-based learning production. They have diversity. It's the multiple evaluations that lead the way. It's through all these observations that we can infer the student's level of competence. So it's normal not to have a lot of skills and that they will be observed in different educational activities in different courses. I can never have a skill, a UE. I could have a learning outcome, a UE, but that would be very limited. Normally, we will at least look at it through several activities. So with this idea in mind, I took the example of speech therapy, but we could do the same exercise with what I had defined for you. They have their level of development, their critical learning, since you see in the columns where we see the gray squares and the red squares. These are what we call resources, if I translate it, the UEs. In fact, these are the educational activities where this learning achievement is evaluated. So you see it, identify the prevention measures. It is in one activity. There are ones like identifying resources and support networks that are across 3 activities, some across 4, some across 5. It depends on the activity. At the beginning, we are somewhat in our logic of crossing. We will put crosses everywhere. Gradually, we will refine to say, but what are we really evaluating from the perspective? Graded. And so they're not from a formative perspective, where I can do it in many educational activities. But if I look from the perspective of certification, development of skills, and they will develop SAE, the famous learning and evaluation situations. Let me get back to what an SAE is. An SAE is an authentic task that we will organize to allow the development of skills. So the students will create a production. It can be material, it can be immaterial, but we are generally in the production of a potential professional context. So it makes sense for the student. It requires them to choose from their internal and external resources. It requires them to realign themselves with the objective. And of course, there is the perspective of an expert, teachers, peers. We are really in something that forces the student to engage. They must learn through action. They are truly engaged in this task. So it cannot just be an exam, you understand. It can be a variety of things. So among the varieties, I have chosen a few examples for you from the works of Préjean Bernard and Kozanaitis. But as you can see, a piece of work, an experiment, an exhibition, a clinic, a simulation, cases, presentations at a conference, projects, internships. I have placed small blue arrows on what seemed more suitable in your context, but again, this is just my interpretation based on my understanding of certain things. So as you can see, there is a variety of possibilities. It's not just the portfolio. The portfolio is a possible tool, a possible way to work on AAs, but I can have a variety of them. What is important is that the student is engaged in this task, that we are in a production logic that allows you to say, oh yes, when I look here, are the skills this AEA allows to develop. So yes, your role is essential as a teacher. It is an evaluation that is much more complex and will require much more reflection from the student. Obviously, the more complex it is, the less AI will be able to do it in their place. The simpler it is, the more AI will be able to do it in their place. So you have a challenge in terms of formulating your competencies, the expectations of the competency, what products are we talking about? So choosing an AEA, what deliverable do you expect from the students? How does it link with my learning outcomes? How do I ensure that it allows us to evaluate them? What resources? The student will be invited to utilize the ones they have, but perhaps even others, and then your activity planning. You are the holders of it. No one can do it for you. AI might be able to help you plan it, but you will have to provide it with all the inputs that allow it to make an intelligent proposal. So AI won't be able to do anything without you. We will be in the process of constructing an instruction. But can it produce something for you? Yes. And so this famous AI, remember, I would like to point out something, which is that, yes, nearly 40% of university students in Quebec have reported having plagiarized at least one assignment during their studies. So we will need to go with things that are more complex. We were in 2018, imagine today in 2025, it will not decrease. Why? Because a student remains a student. And you know what? We do it too when we are students. It's important to be in a position of what am I asking of them so that it makes sense. We know that the more it makes sense, the less the student will go in that direction. So we must change our evaluation culture. We should no longer think of it as a simple test. The more students perceive it as a critical issue and that it's dangerous and that if they fail, it's the end of their life, the more they tend to cheat. We know that tasks lead to anxiety and that anxiety leads to avoidance strategies. All the literature proves it to us. So that's what we need to change if we don't want to be fooled as teachers, because the frustration of grading something produced by an AI, I have it, you have it, I understand it. Just as it frustrated me when a student took another student's work or asked their mother to do the work, it's just that their mother was a seriously slower AI. But in reality, it was already the use of someone else. It's certain that Claude or ChatGPT are much faster than the mother of most of our students. But we are indeed in this perspective of cultural change. And that's what you will be doing this afternoon. There are tools, and I could provide them to Julian if you are interested, but my colleagues, Jose-Anne Cote and Melanie Cabana at the Support Services Center have developed a tool, a kind of grid, to help us reflect on whether my evaluation is vulnerable to generative artificial intelligence tools. And you will be able to get ideas with the grid. It's very concrete. There are questions they ask you, and it can really help you. Is it magical? No. Will we still need to move forward? Yes, but I think we have addressed the issue and are reflecting on it. Certainly burying our heads in the sand is not going to help us move forward. So there are guides offered for activities. You see, these are my colleagues at HEC. The idea is not to promote my institution, but to show that we are involved in this. You will also notice that it is an open educational resource. So it is usable, modifiable, and improvable. And it gives you ideas. I tell you, take advantage of what exists elsewhere. You are in construction mode, go see what others are doing. It is obviously a good strategy. So to evaluate, remember that you will need evaluation grids. Here is an example provided by Labi 7, where we see that the student progresses from unvalidated competence. Here we are dealing with a portfolio because there are missing traces, there is a validity issue, there is an authenticity issue, up to a validation. We see, and it actually breaks down what the student has. So by production, it will require us to create grids. Yes. Will it take time? Yes. When it is well done, is it an evaluative gain? Yes. Does it reduce subjectivity? Yes. Does it provide much more information to the student in a practice of self-regulation improvement? Yes. I tested it with a colleague in law, for example, where we developed a grid for the creation of essays, which called upon several disciplines. He wanted the students to do the exercise 3 times. When there are 200 of them, it's extremely long to correct. With the criteria-based grid, he saved a tremendous amount of time. He has an evaluation that is much less subject to the usual bias. Fatigue, intra-copy biases, we reduced. And moreover, since the students had the grid, it allowed them to work outside. They were even able to do peer evaluation, where some students agreed to assess the papers, the essays of their peers, and we really engaged in a communal production. So it's effective. Julian, I see the time I'm wrapping up, don't worry. I wanted to show you some very practical things precisely to bring you back to the idea of utilizing existing frameworks. This one is from our colleagues at HESO in Switzerland. As you can see, it's a nursing program. We can see their competencies. I wanted to show you. They have defined the novice level, and then you see they note everything it means. The novice level considers the person at the center, organizes their activities, prioritizes. You see at the bottom their overall assessment. So for them, it's an observed SAE. They will mark it as acquired in the process of acquisition, not acquired, and they know that the criteria they need to observe are above. You see it, it's the first year one, same skill, role of the leader, intermediate level. So we are further along in the development trajectory I mentioned to you with other criteria, of course. This is what we could call their learning achievements, the comments. Third year, again, the same skill, competent level, more complex, the observations. So this allows them to use, ultimately, with the same skill, of course, we illustrate their development trajectory and the learning achievements that emerge. This is an essay where they will be able to have the same grid that is shared by all the people who will evaluate this essay. So, not to conclude and to open up for discussion, I remind you that the competency-based approach and its evaluation can sometimes be difficult. We really feel like we're moving through mud. We tell ourselves, but I'll never make it. My exam was still quite simple. It was easy. But in fact, when we get there, remember that we are in a collective mindset. We're all in the same boat. It's not just you as an individual sitting here. It's all of us. Because the development of students' skills, because the assessment of their development trajectory is a collective activity. I'm not telling you to take all the weight off your shoulders, because you will also have to go through the mud. But tell yourself that it's together that we will achieve the competency-based approach. This means is to enable sustainable quality learning for students and to ensure that our diploma holds value today as a higher education institution. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing with you. I can't hear you, Julian, for example. There, can you hear me? Is it okay? Yes, it's good. I can hear you.
Thank you very much, Christelle, for this energy and enthusiasm. I think it really inspired a lot of people. As you said, we are a bit constrained by time, but I see we still have a good 15 minutes for questions and answers. What we are going to do is pass the microphone around. If people could raise their hands if they have questions.
Or comments. You can't throw anything at me from over there at the end, so I have no fear. Then I will, of course, leave you my PowerPoint, and I can share the links to the concrete things for AI. For the grids, with great pleasure, of course.
I believe you would like us to also translate your entire presentation into English with a little agent, you know, the agent, to translate directly into English. Absolutely. We will send it to the English-speaking colleague.
That's perfect. I hadn't thought that I could have made the slideshow in English and the discussion in French.
So there's Jerzy.
Big thank you for the presentation. And the thing that struck me, in Con, the most important innovation, apart from skills, the idea of collaboration, so teaching as a collective work, or others. The research that I am part of various organizations that are focused in this dance is way. It always takes a lot of time, the exchange of information, the exchange of ideas, and collaboration. So, do you have any ideas on how to create space for this exchange, space to share?
You are absolutely right when you mentioned the space for collaboration in a competency-based approach. And I would tell you that it's one of the major challenges of the competency-based approach, but not only that. And if you'll allow me a very brief digression. And as if when I started my career, I worked on educational and curricular innovations. And in innovation models, there is a challenge, which is the collegiality among the actors. And I would tell you that the analysis of the field shows us that most innovations that fail, I will review. Most of the time, many innovations that fail are due to the difficulty of collegiality among the actors. That is to say, we claim to be collective, but we aren't really. And this is the challenge in higher education institutions, We're a bit like a herd of cats. We all agree to follow others if we are the first and if we go in our own direction. And then, if I may say so, I am part of this collective because we have been conditioned into it. We succeeded with, and despite the system, in a competitive system. So it's really a transformation of our mindset. To achieve this, our institutions need to provide us with collaborative spaces, use our pedagogical meetings for real educational encounters, not to discuss, do we still have paper in the printer? Truly be in a mindset of discussing educational issues. That means accepting, not entering a space of judgment, being able to work as a team. Now, we can't work on a 5-year plan, it doesn't work. So what we often propose, and when we create learning situations, for example, is to gather together. 3-4 colleagues, start a first draft, and then subject it to peer review, but in the benevolent sense of the term. Here, when I talk about peer review, it means telling colleagues, okay, we've made a first board draft, we're going to ask you to improve it. And having teams that ultimately allow us to co-construct together, but in small groups. In transformations of this type, we often have a leader come, someone who is identified as such. It can be our educational advisor, it can be our department head, but not necessarily. We choose a person who becomes somewhat the contact person we work with, and then we will have a few co-leaders, our primary followers, those who are there to hold the fort when things aren't going well. And then it's with this small group that we work, and then we move towards the community. And within this community, we can also have moments where we step out of our group collective, suggesting to someone from the academic office to see if what we propose, does it fit within the schedule? Suggesting to someone from the technical systems, if we do this, is it feasible with the digital learning environment we have proposed to students? Saying, if we propose our evaluation format like this, do you understand what we expect from you? For example, in pharmacy, in dental sciences, at the University of Strasbourg, that had been the issue. When they created their SAE, the first ones were failures. The students were extremely anxious. They realized they didn't understand the instructions, so we had poorly prepared them in terms of pedagogical strategies. So we revised some things, we did formative assessments, and at times you could even go to companies to see if the criteria and indicators for evaluations make sense, in particular, how they say is like internships. So you see, we are going to be in the logic of smaller collective, larger collective, but indeed it will be necessary to have time and spaces to do it. Sometimes we have more than we think, but it's mainly a recognition of that work that our colleagues often wish for, and which sometimes is a little bit swept under the rug. We don't necessarily want money, we at least want the work done for the community to be recognized. Does that partly answer your question? Sometimes I get carried away. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Yadi, for the question. Thank you, Christelle. So any other questions?
Comments, things that it brings to mind for you. There's a question here.
Thank you for your presentation. I echo my colleagues' compliments. It was really very dynamic and very rich. I had a bit of a general question. That is, we are often faced with topics where we must, of course, evaluate a skill, but still, there are pieces of knowledge that we should measure and ensure they are well understood, certain things, that they have made the connection between certain concepts. Yes, we must even ensure that they have understood the definition of a concept, especially in management or things like that. How do we manage in these situations? What is your experience on this? Thank you.
Indeed, you are right. What we notice, however, and here I return to our stance, obviously, as teachers sometimes, we have the perception that we must control everything, evaluate everything, it may verify everything. We find that ultimately it leads students to do a lot of surface learning, to give us the minimum and to compensate. It creates a lot of frustration for us. Sometimes we feel like we've spent a lot of time and the students haven't achieved the learning. I think you are right. However, in each educational activity, there are concepts where we say to ourselves, we must ensure that they master them well in order to move on to a more complex situation. We have two strategies. Either we have a few key concepts and we say to ourselves, we must verify them through a more basic system, a knowledge-based approach, and we fully embrace it. This can be through tests, it can be through quizzes, but we will do things that are less time consuming for us, less time consuming for the students. If we are in understanding a situation that allows us to validate comprehension and not just the repetition and of the definition, for example. However, you could also have it in the essay where what is proposed ensures there is an obligation to demonstrate their understanding. And these essays can be a bit less complex. We can have only 2 or 3 disciplines sharing the same concepts, and where putting the concept into action will demonstrate their understanding or not. However, and here we have an issue, we will have students who sometimes will fail this SAE because indeed it's a lack of knowledge or understanding at the base. So sometimes allowing them to validate in a formative way their knowledge or understanding, that is not through a grade, but for example, with quizzes on the platform. That can be a strategy. And there you could, and on this, you will see that sometimes I'm a little strict, but sometimes colleagues tell me, yeah, but I do things and my students don't do them. Then I say, well, I understand. But in learning, to learn is an act we do alone in contact with others. But you cannot make a student learn. You can set up the conditions that favor their learning, but if they choose not to engage cognitively, meaning in terms of time or affectively, there is something that belongs to them. And for that, we need to be much more explicit than we usually are, because we are very kind to the students. Oh, poor thing, it didn't go well. No, but wait, here, you need to commit. So you might conduct tests and tell them it doesn't count, there will be no points. But if you don't master the concepts, when it comes to the SAE, it might not work. And it's up to you to commit. So you could also have things, and we sometimes see this in question banks that colleagues develop to use them. So to have question banks free, but because it takes us time to build them. When I was teaching large groups, I would ask the students at the end of certain sequences that worked on models, on concepts, I would say to them, propose 2 exam questions to me on a small piece of paper. And in fact, I had a question bank that the students were building for me as we went along. And when you do that for 4 or 5 years, I have a chemistry colleague at the University of Orléans who told me, you have such a good idea. She had 300 students. She told me, not everyone is going to fill out their little paper, but I will have a lot. And you will see the questions become more complex as time goes on. The students understand more and more, and they use them. Even for these exam questions, they would take concrete problems produced by the students, so it can help us. So sometimes I will do knowledge checks when I feel the need, but really in a very precise way. Sometimes I will integrate them into SAE. Does that answer your question, dear colleague? Great.
Thank you. For last question, I think maybe you, but it will be.
Yes, I promise to be shorter and quicker, but I'm very excited, as you might have noticed.
It shows. Benoit, please go ahead. Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was indeed very interesting and stimulating. In particular, you mentioned something about when we think in a disciplinary way, because we think in a disciplinary way, it's difficult to do otherwise. It's up to the students to piece things together. In fact, it's extremely important. For example, I teach strategy course. In strategy, if we don't include a bit of finance in it, a lot of things are still missing. But since I don't teach finance courses and I don't know exactly when they take them, what they do, this is a point I revisit because I think it's very important. I have 2 questions. The first question is, I have the impression, in fact, listening to you, I wonder, do you think that ultimately evaluation will take up more or less space overall? In the competency-based approach, you mean, in the competency-based approach. And with the digital tools we have today, we can imagine videos, a whole range of things. I have the impression that it is intended to take up more space. But I would like to hear your opinion on that. And I have a second very specific question. You said there can be no compensation, and you were very precise about that, very clear. There can be no compensation between competencies, as there would be between disciplines. My question is simple, why not?
Those are excellent questions. I hope you have 3 hours ahead of you because obviously I'm super excited. I will even go back to your first comment on the question of interdisciplinarity that you raised. It's a major change in the competency-based approach to really have this vision of the program. That is, where does my educational activity appear in relation to the rest, Makuinatsu? How does it contribute to the competencies? How do others contribute? And you're right, that too is a change in our profession to no longer have a siloed vision, but to understand that we are part of a training journey. So it's a real change. It's important, but it's a real added value. And it will really allow you to better connect your pieces. You are absolutely right. The approach by competence, will it require more or less evaluation with regard to the IAG? In my opinion, it will require us to do so. Normally, the PC was intended to reduce evaluation. That is to say, in a perspective of trusting colleagues, it is through complex situations that we will validate the different elements of students' knowledge and skills. Now, I understand that it's not easy to let them go. These are much more complex evaluations to construct. So what we have seen currently is a lot of in-between systems. A reduction at the level of the UE, but often a slightly broader SAE that will be created. However, where you are right is that the IAG will really require us to revise our processes. And I think we will move much more towards a logic of exchange with the students, especially at the informal level. I'm not sure we will grade more, but I think we will discuss the processes much more. And thus, the learning achieved by the students at the level of cognitive processing, really what they do, and even metacognitive, meaning reflecting on how they process the information, then what we did before. Because we will no longer be able to rely solely on the product. The product will be too much, at least at the current time. And very honestly, the initial research around software that allows detection of productions with an AI brings a lot of false positives and false negatives. So for the moment, we will not be able to use them very clearly. And I think this raises real ethical questions for us. So you see, my balance will be more on certain aspects on the less, perhaps on the summative aspects. And precisely this idea of compensation that you raise, it's because often skills are very unique units in themselves. That is to say, if we think about the skill you had in your program on ecological transitions, it was formulated, let me just take a second to find it, act as a professional and citizen to address the major challenges of ecological, social, and economic transitions. Other skills you have do not at all call upon the development of the same elements in terms of knowledge, learning. So it's as if they are addressing two completely different subjects. That's okay too. It might also allow you to reduce your number of skills, meaning that when we see that our skills are not unique in themselves, that they are somewhat permeable, it means we will be able to narrow them down. That's why it's non-compensable. However, in several programs, what we see is within the same skill. There are educational activities that will compensate, but the skills themselves, and here I think of programs that sometimes have 4-6 skills for the entire 3 or 5 year training program. The colleagues in speech therapy, for example, that you have 5 extremely different skills from one another. We have one like acting as a professional, and then assuming prevention, being 2 completely different things. They are not compensable. That's in that sense. Does that answer your question or questions?
Thank you very much, Christelle, for everything. We will have to conclude with a big round of applause for Christelle. Thank you.
Also for the trust from a distance. I know that, Stefan, you would have wanted me to be there, and I really would have liked to be there. If I could have, I would have been there. But thank you for the chance to let me participate.
We have a great sound, really a great image, so we are really lucky in that regard too. Thank you again, Christelle, and listen, we will continue this work together and now move on to the practical application.
Thank you all.